Right, so hello everyone, and welcome to the first activity of the Cañada Center at the LSE this Michaelmas term. So the Cañada Center has been around for quite a while. I took it over 2 years ago. During COVID, we had a lot of online activities. Now we're starting, and we did quite a few in person last year. But this term it's our pleasure to have Shauna Brail with us, who is coming all the way from Toronto to give us a talk on Beyond COVID-19, the Future of Cities and Urban Policy. Shauna is an associate professor at the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And she's an economic geographer, a very well-known economic geographer, I'd say, and an urban planner with a lot of research that mainly focuses on the transformation of cities as a result of economic, social, and cultural change. So whether you're doing any of the masters here, regional urban planning, or local economic development, or any other masters in the department, you're a member of the center, or you're doing a PhD, this is something that will be of interest for you. She's also involved in one of the exciting new ventures in which I think some of us are involved as well, which is this launch of this new paper, this new journal called Papers in Economic Geography. But I'm sure you haven't come to listen to me here, you have come to listen to Shauna. So I'm going to give the floor to you. So Shauna, the floor is entirely.
Thank you very much, Andrés. And thank you to the Cañada Center for hosting, and to Neil for also all of his work in helping to organize. It is a real pleasure to be here today and to present some of my work. I also want to say a thank you and a welcome to two of my former U of T students, Jonah Witowski and Katerina Mizraki, who are both studying in the UK. Thank you especially for making the trek to the room and from Cambridge to come here. It's really, really nice. It's always wonderful. It's great to teach, and it's even greater to follow up with your students once they've graduated and continue to do amazing things in the world. So what I want to talk about today is some of the sort of complex, enduring impacts and implications of COVID-19 with respect to cities. And this is, as you can imagine, a relatively new area of focus for my research, but a very natural fit when the pandemic emerged in early 2020. My deep interest in what it would mean for cities, because of course the pandemic has had incredibly disruptive impacts and implications for cities. And so since about March 2020, I first engaged in writing some op-ed pieces about kind of early days looking at the pandemic. And then I wrote a commentary piece in Environment and Planning B, talking about what COVID meant for cities, looking for patterns amongst the turmoil, which I'll talk a little bit about today. This was followed by a piece in regional studies, regional science. It was a regional graphic looking at the impact of the pandemic in Toronto and on restaurant closures on restaurants, a sector which I hadn't thought about very much before, but in fact, when we look at restaurants and the restaurant scene, it really is a kind of a signal, a harbinger of the vibrancy of cities. A couple of months ago, published a piece together with Mark Kleinman, who most recently from King's College London in the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society, looking again at a case study of Toronto. And then just last week, I published an essay in a magazine called Current History, which had a very similar title to today's presentation, called COVID-19 and the Future of Urban Policy and Planning. And so what I want to focus on today is a bit of an overview of all of this work, as well as thinking about what does this mean for cities going forward, particularly with an eye to some of the biggest cities, global cities. And so the presentation is structured as followed in 4 parts. If you think back to March and April 2020, probably the most enduring, kind of loudest conversations and debates were around whether or not COVID-19 was equal to the death of cities. And so I'd like to talk a bit about that. Then there'll be a case study of Toronto, including a dashboard and what I call a super chart, which has a new name now because super chart didn't really seem like the right title for it. And then to take a look at what are the common threads amongst cities? What are the things that all cities are thinking about, and how do we understand the implications of COVID and of city building moving into the future? And finally, I'll close with a few comments about the future of cities and urban policy. So again, that's the sort of at the earliest emergence of COVID, images of cities gone completely silent, empty streets, office buildings locked up, nobody around, some doctored pictures of dolphins swimming in the canals again in Venice because they were so clean and available. But really, really worrisome concerns about the future of cities and whether or not cities could endure and people would want to concentrate again. Debates about transmission really focus on sort of the role and the connectedness between cities. So again, at the outset of COVID, similar to the patterns we saw when SARS emerged in the early 2000s, early transmission was very much connected to cities that were networked at a global scale. Some people thought that because Toronto had experience with SARS, that Toronto would be well suited to navigate COVID-19. And I'm here to say I don't think this was the case, maybe at the very beginning, but certainly not over the 2.5 years that's followed. What we started to learn, though, when we dug deeper beneath the surface, and this is lots of researchers, lots of scholars, was that actually urban density was less significant than things like income and housing conditions and crowded housing, even race and intra-urban inequality. And so in a place like Toronto, where we say Toronto is very much a divided city, there are pockets of great wealth and there are pockets of great poverty. And when we map out the earliest cases of COVID, the wealthy pockets, the pockets where people are maybe connected through business travel, connected through leisure travel, to other parts of the world, that's where we saw the greatest number of cases. But very, very quickly, once COVID entered into the city and was spread through sort of regular everyday activity and physical proximity, what we saw, in fact, was that the number of cases in the lower income parts of the city was way beyond the spread of COVID in the wealthier parts. And a lot of that has to do with type of work. So could people work from home, or were they required to go out to work, and did they take transit to work, and did all of those activities expose them, versus people who were very comfortable and able to work from home and also able to isolate entirely alone if they felt unwell because they had the space. The other thing that we know is that institutions matter at all scales. And that goes from the sort of the local level to regional and provincial governments and national governments and even international organizations, including those that help support the distribution of vaccines from higher income to lower income countries. And so we see here a lot of the sort of influence of some of our very traditional economic geography theories and ideas, but applying them to understanding COVID and also hopefully to stemming some of the most negative implications of what COVID would lead to. This is just a look in the early days of all of the kind of doom and gloom headlines. Will COVID spell the end of urban density? Will people want to concentrate when physical proximity is so dangerous? Will this mean finally that, and the concentration is over, the benefits of agglomeration in space are done? And a real debate both amongst the media headlines, amongst scholars, amongst many people, a fascinating debate. And I'll give you my take on it in a minute. There are all these things that said, the city is going to die, starting from, early pandemics in 1918. The Spanish flu was very deadly, and it was very deadly in particular in cities. It also required the closure of activities. It required physical distancing. And there was, just as cities were beginning to rise, cities were dampened. Urban life was very much dampened for quite a while. But previous pandemics did not equal the end of cities. In New York City, for instance, between 1910 and 1930, which is, which covers the period, including the Spanish flu. What we know is that the population grew from just under 5 million to about almost 7 million. And so here we have evidence that the Spanish flu and previous pandemics did not equal the end of the city. Same thing with the automobile. When Ford began to mass manufacture cars and people were able to afford them in the 1920s and 1930s, there big headlines. The city is doomed, the end of the city. Certainly, the growth of and the adoption of the mass automobile and the transformation of places in response to accommodating automobiles and to accommodating the sprawl and the flexibility and the sort of moves that they enabled outside of the dense core was transformative, and it was painful for many central cities. And a place like Chicago, for instance, lost population for many, many years. But again, Chicago did not die, it revived, and it continues to be a thriving, vibrant place. The internet in the early 2000s was heralded to be the dawn of telework. Everybody would be able to work from home, would be able to work from anywhere. I remember must have been in the early 2000s, I was at the beach somewhere in California, and it was the first time I ever saw a person working on a laptop outside. and I immediately went and took a picture, probably with my camera, because I definitely didn't have a smartphone at that point. But even though we have the ability to work on beaches now, and even though we have the ability to work remotely, telework comprised about 5% of all work up until very recently. And then COVID-19. And again, COVID-19 has endured for now 2.5 years. The pandemic is not over. And yet, what we see is that it is causing change, it is causing great disruption, but it too is not the end of cities. Early days, we saw these very difficult drops. The London subway system lost 95% of its riders. Downtown Toronto offices were at 5% occupancy. New York City rents by November 2020 had dropped by nearly 25%. And we saw these sort of commonalities across big cities, again, giving sort of fodder to the idea that, depending on how long this lasts, we are going to have a real challenge bringing people back to cities. Especially in terms of subway ridership and downtown offices, we continue to experience a lot of difficulty here, which I will get into a bit later on. The rents piece is really interesting, and I'll also talk about that a bit more. So what are the things that we thought we were going to say goodbye to in the early days of COVID-19? A lot of effort, a lot of emphasis and discussion on what's happening in terms of office occupancy and office work. And so this material is taken from Nicholas Bloom and his team. They doing amazing work on work from home. And they do a regular survey every month, and they've produced some of the sort of richest, best data on working from home. And what they show is that pre-pandemic, this is, work from home was at about 4.7%. And pandemic hits, and it shoots up to about 61.5%. And that is, as places lock down, as governments and offices and others said, if you can work from home, work from home. There we have this tremendous number of people working from home. As the pandemic continues, we see that number start to decline. So now in the U.S., and this is a survey in the US, they're now at just under 30% work from home. What other things did we think we were saying goodbye to? Transit is another one. This is from the TTC CEO's report in June 2020. And this is a measurement of taps with our Presto card on the transit system. Right around here, around March 14th is when we started our lockdown. And you can see that it just takes a total dive. And for many months, it never recovers. Transit, ridership, is under a third of what it had been before the pandemic, several months in. We also thought we're going to say goodbye to physical retail, and this data actually shows Canadian e-commerce sales between March 2020 and February 2021. And essentially, this line, here we have the pandemic, we have a huge jump, we have some new strains, another big jump. Shopify, a Canadian tech kind of darling, increased in value during this time, fourfold to, I think, over $200 billion. I'll tell you a little bit about what happened to it more recently, but this was a signal that e-commerce had been accelerated by something like 30 years during the pandemic. And so the expectation is, we see this now, we're likely to see, this is now the future, and reveals the problems and the challenges of making assumptions during a time of crisis, even though the crisis seemed to be lasting a very long time and continues to be lasting a long time. And the other thing that we started to say goodbye to was the handshake. This is a survey from, again, from the work from home research, a survey of how do you meet a person? What is the question? What do you do when you're introduced to somebody? Do you shake hands? Do you not touch? Do you verbally greet? Do you remember the fist bump and the elbow bump? And the impression here was, what are you going to do after COVID? I think this is also a good example of why I'd be very cautious of survey results, even though most of this material is really excellent, but this one is sort of off. And I'll show you why in a couple of minutes. So almost 2/3 of people said pre-COVID, they shook hands, and post-COVID, nearly half of them are not going to touch at all. And another, just under a third of them might do a fist bump. So, and I don't know if any of you went to conferences or meetings during COVID where you had the sticker system, right? The red is like, stay away. The green is, you can hug me. And the yellow is somewhere in between, stay away. Maybe it's a handshake. So it was around this time of this work that I wrote a piece in Environment Planning, trying to see what are some of the commonalities, what are the things that bring all of these ideas together, and what can we see by looking across cities. And so I divided it into 4 things. The impacts are spatial, they're sectoral, they're interconnected, and they're unequal. On the spatial side, even early on and continuing to this day, we see that the spatial implications of COVID at the geography of a city or a metro region are very much concentrated in the city's core, in the central business district. In Toronto, for instance, 1/3 of all jobs in the city of Toronto are located in the downtown core. Many of those jobs are office jobs, and many of those people were working remotely from home. And the implications of that are a very empty core. Real, drop off on our transit system, which in Toronto very specifically, especially our subway, very specifically serves the core. We have a 2-line subway system. You don't know how fortunate you are here, but our subway goes like this, and that's it. We have an excellent bus system, but the subway leaves much to be desired. The other thing about looking at COVID in cities, there was a sectoral kind of basis for some of the challenges that actually, when COVID first hit, there was this sense that everybody would be equally hard hit. I think that's just kind of our natural tendency. There's a crisis, everyone will be equally hard hit. But that wasn't the case, because in fact, what happened is that some industries, some sectors, they benefited. They grew dramatically. Tech, finance, industries and sectors that were able to pivot well to working remotely, and or whose services were needed and desired by a workforce and a population that was remote and staying distant. And then on the flip side of that, we had sectors that were supportive sectors, what we called at the time sometimes frontline workers, workers in grocery stores, workers in healthcare workers. But we also had the people who served all of the tens and thousands and millions of people working in the downtown cores, working in restaurants and working in other hair care, and other ancillary services who lost work altogether. And so we have this real unevenness in job loss that's based on what sector one works in. The other piece is the interconnection, and I think actually I sort of gave both the sectoral and the interconnected at the same time. But when the office workers stay home, the downtown people who, the downtown workers in restaurants and salons and grocery stores and all those things, if the people who are using those services are no longer there, they're out of work, they have nothing to do, they're out of a job, and they are really suffering. And in Canada, in fact, what we found was this great inequality, and I think that the inequality goes throughout most places in most cities. It was the first time in Canada that we started to collect survey data based on race, because before that there was never an effort to collect race-based data. But what was found, in fact, is that the greatest impacts were felt by by people who were racialized, by people who were in low income employment previously, and so we had this very unequal impact of COVID, depending on income, race, and also actually age, that younger people were very much sort of positioned without work at many times, because when programs stopped, programs ended, there weren't summer jobs for students in that first summer. It was a very difficult experience. So let's go back to some of those things that maybe ended. This was very easy to find. The handshake has not disappeared. And I found multiple pictures of British prime ministers shaking hands with King Charles, the Queen, all in the space of the last month. So the handshake has not disappeared. I've probably shaken about 5 hands today. I don't know about you. Physical retail also hasn't disappeared. So here we have the line. The line went up, I don't know. The line goes up and the line comes right back down. And the converse of this is that activity in physical retailers has increased. There is a geography to this, so it's not everywhere, but foot traffic, even in the downtowns, has started to increase as a result of sort of moving towards a kind of amenitized space that encourages these kinds of activities. Two things that remain more on the fence are transit. So this is the most recent reporting period for the TTC. And we see, so this is the most recent line. We see it's progressing. This is the budgeted line. So it's still below the 2022 budget, which was already revised for COVID. It's about 30% below where the actuals, where it would have been expected to be. And yet it actually has experienced quite a bit of growth. It's at about 65% now of pre-normal. And buses are at 70-something%, subways are at 60%, and streetcars are at 50-something%. One thing I will say is that COVID has taught us the value of good data that we can understand, and there is a real lack of good data. The TTC releases these data points in their monthly CEO reports, and every month I have to go and search for it. Finally, hello office. The office is the thing that we have been the most reluctant to return to, despite a lot of effort. And there's evidence of return. There are a number of organizations in North America that are tracking return to the office with different kinds of data and different qualities of data. One, as I was telling Neil earlier, is based on key fobs. So you think your key fob is your key to your office, but actually it's also a tracking device. Someone can tell how often you're in there, when you go, which days you go, et cetera, what time you left. The office is a real challenge. So I want to move now to the case study of Toronto. How many of you have been to Toronto before? Less than a third, I would say. You don't raise your hand. So Toronto is the largest city in Canada, 3 million people in the city proper, 6.5 million in the metro area. It's expected to grow to about 10 million people by sometime between 2040 and 2050. It's one of the most diverse cities in the world, based on a number of different measures. The first is its economy is very diverse. There's a strong focus in financial services. It's one of the largest financial services centers in North America and globally. Its tech sector and tech employment has grown substantially over the last decade. It is the second or third largest food and beverage manufacturing center in North America as well. as a big city, it has really big challenges. Housing supply and affordability is pretty much at the top of the list. Transportation infrastructure, I mentioned our two-line subway, thinking about how to invest in transportation infrastructure, not just public transit, but also things like micromobility. Scooters are actually illegal to use in the city of Toronto because of a debate that City Council is having about whether they, cause more harm than benefit. And in terms of governance, we have municipal government, no formal regional government, but some regional governance, meaning we have some loosely affiliated organizations that focus on sort of branding Toronto at a global scale and marketing Toronto, and also some loose associations of the mayors from the biggest cities in Toronto. For instance, Mississauga is a city of about 500,000-600,000 people, and yet it's very much overshadowed by Toronto, its much larger neighbor. And increasingly, there is both provincial engagement and interference. And as an example of that interference, the province just recently announced, in an effort to encourage the building of more housing, that they're actually going to override some municipal zoning guidelines and permissions and not require developers to pay full development fees if housing will be affordable, but then how is anyone going to be able to afford to provide the amenities that go along with those homes? So lots and lots of interesting things happening in Toronto. You may know Toronto for its beautiful skyline, the CN Tower, its downtown core. One of the projects that I worked on starting in about September 2020 was a dashboard called, it was originally called Toronto After the First Wave, which sounded like a great title in September 2020. It was rebranded as Post-Pandemic Toronto, but the website is still called Toronto After the First Wave. And Toronto, as of the summer 2022, had gone through 6 waves of COVID. We're now in the 7th wave. Deaths are currently at about 4,400. They're actually relatively, Toronto and Canada has done well in terms of the measures that were in place to prevent fatalities. The vaccination rate is very high. First vaccines is just under 90%, and 2 vaccines, which is considered fully vaccinated, is in the high 80%, and 3 vaccines for the only data I could find on this was people 70 and over, it was approaching 65%. So high rates of vaccination, some of the longest lockdowns in the world. This is the data on public transit in Toronto and public transit by mode of a bus, streetcar. Here's the bus, streetcar, subway. This is not quite as up to date as what I presented earlier, but you can see here the massive sort of the drop, the falling off a cliff of mobility by public transit, and the very slow return. This here is data on office occupancy. This data is provided by a company called Strategic Regional Research Alliance. It's based on a survey of buildings, and I would encourage you, whenever you're looking at data about a city or about anything, how important it is to understand where that data comes from. There is some really tremendous data. This data is based on a survey of about 40 of the largest buildings in Toronto's downtown core, and it suggests that by last April, office occupancy was at about 25%. The other thing we have is data from commercial realtors, Cushman & Wakefield, that shows office vacancy rates are higher than they've been in over a decade. And conversely, industrial vacancy rates are very, very low. There's almost no vacancy of industrial land. And this is in part because of the increasing emphasis on industrial warehousing space and also other kinds of industrial spaces needed to serve people in a digital economy. In terms of real estate, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but here we have, this is the prices for condos and they're by year. The middle green is average semi-detached homes and the darker green is average detached home prices. And we can see that detached home prices in particular, that single family homes in the city of Toronto, 70% of the land area is zoned for single-family homes, despite the fact that 50% of our population lives in multi-family dwellings. And the prices have gone through the roof. There have been a number of new sort of macroeconomic policy levers used more recently, notably interest rate increases that have actually helped to bring down the price of houses, but they've also contributed to a reduced number of houses being on the market at all as people are waiting. This is what I call my COVID super chart, but it's also called Toronto and COVID-19 pandemic policy patterns. I know it's very dense, but I'd like to just take you through a couple of things on here. So at the top level, we have the different strains of COVID, starting with the SARS-CoV-2, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Omicron. You can see these big circles. These are COVID fatalities. We can see the most fatalities happened in the very first wave, another big bump of fatalities during Omicron, and much smaller numbers of fatalities now. The bulk of the fatalities have been in people age 70 and over, like the very vast majority. Here we have some of the policy measures that were implemented. So the state of emergency in Toronto lasted 777 days. The mask mandate also is here in the pink. It lasted just until March 2022, with a little bit longer for transit and healthcare institutions. Healthcare institutions still have a mask mandate. Our schools were closed for almost longer than anywhere else to in-person learning, and we had remote learning. And so they were closed in the very beginning for months, and then a middle period in the winter of 2021, and then again in 2021 in the spring, and again during Omicron. And then lastly, we had non-essential businesses closed. This was mostly stores and shopping malls. And restaurants were closed for even longer to indoor dining, which made it really, really challenging for restaurants to survive. And so a different piece of work I did looked at scraped data from Yelp. And what we found actually is a lot of innovation in the restaurant sector, not a lot of jobs for restaurant workers, but a lot of innovation on the part of restaurateurs. The other thing I'll point out here, and this is very up-to-date data, is the unemployment rate. When it changes, it started at just under about 7%. It goes up to about 14%. It drops pretty quickly. It doesn't look like a very significant change when you put it in this context. We're now almost where we were at the start of the pandemic in terms of unemployment. We can see house prices. Again, people thought, well, why bother living in Toronto where prices are so elevated? I can go anywhere. But actually, when we look at house prices, that's actually not how what happened. That's not how people behave. So price houses declined a bit at the very beginning, but they started to increase by June of 2020 within just a few months. Rents were a little bit different because where rents were concerned, and this is average one-bedroom apartment rents, which started off right before the pandemic at about $2,200 Canadian, and now we've just started to increase there at $2,500. But in this sort of midsection of COVID in 2021, rents had depressed quite a bit. Again, there was geographically uneven, so rents were lower in the downtown core than and then in the inner suburbs. It was a kind of nice inversion in a way. And then we have the orange is transit ridership, so we can see the big decline, and transit and office occupancy go together. But transit breaks away here, and I think in part, this is related to the enticement and encouragement of the return to public life, even if it didn't mean the return to the office. And so protests, parades, celebrations, festivals, just going out to public spaces and a park, all of these things have encouraged a return to transit ridership. But where we're really struggling still is a return to the office, which is still at just under 35%. So briefly, I will sort of go through these kind of common threads that 21st century cities are needing to think about and focused on. The first is thinking through what happens to the central business district. And this is really a plea for, there have been discussions of converting half of the buildings to housing, much needed. We need to increase supply, we need to increase affordability, but it's actually very difficult to convert an office building to housing, and it's also very expensive. And it may not in the end be the greatest thing to do, but maybe there will be, I think increasing there's some effort towards that. But the other piece is around making the central business district look a lot more and feel a lot more like the rest of the city, to ensure that it is activated and animated more than just on the sort of workday basis, to make sure that there are street scale activities and storefronts, and to really think through how to bring people to the core, even if they're not going to the office, or if they're going to the office. There's a lot of work on office buildings that's saying, well, we need these amenitized offices, and there's evidence that says that the higher quality office space is actually very much in demand, and it's lower quality space, older space perhaps with, without a gym, without a ping pong table, or the ability to put a ping pong table, without kind of the lead designation. Those are the spaces that are struggling the most. And so here the idea really is thinking about what to do in the CBD. Toronto, San Francisco, New York, their governments have all struck task forces to come up with a strategy how to do this, because the other thing is that there's also a real loss in the tax base. San Francisco, I think in 2021, lost $400 million in their tax base because of the lack of office activity. Mobility infrastructure is another thing. Big questions about whether or not to continue to invest in mobility infrastructure. Tomorrow or the next day, I'm going to ride on the Elizabeth line, which I understand cost $19 billion and helped open up all kinds of new opportunities for commuters. But as soon as it was, it was open during COVID, and there were discussions right away that I read saying, was it worth it? Should we have bothered? Nobody's commuting. Do we need it? Similar conversations are taking place in New York, where there's a very big infrastructure program under discussion to build a bridge across the Hudson River, I think it is, for commuters, but also for anybody. And if you think that your region is growing and people need to move in that region, the most sustainable way to help people move longer distances is through investments in transit. And yet these are questions that are coming up again and again. Housing, which I've talked about a bit here, but many cities and many global cities are grappling with housing affordability crises. The cost of housing is so high that people cannot afford to both live and work in a city. With remote work so prominent, there is the ability to choose to work remotely and to choose to move out of the city altogether. In order to maintain the vibrancy of our places, we need to create ways to tether people to the city, and one of those is through investments in housing. And we can see all levels of government really working on this at the local level. In Toronto, for instance, we have zoning changes around the permission of laneway homes, which can only really help a small number of, create a small number of units. We have inclusionary zoning, and we have, efforts to look at publicly owned land to understand how better to develop that land and to create more opportunities for affordable housing there. There is no single solution on the housing front, and it really needs kind of all irons in the fire. The provincial government is involved too, and the federal government is involved from a financial perspective. In terms of public space, we saw during COVID and continuing now, just the great desire and demand for high quality public space and for opportunities to be together outdoors. We know there are inequities in terms of the location of public spaces. And we also know that there is, as cities grow, which many of them are, and as the regions grow, we need to continue to invest in high quality public spaces that actually are animated and provide kind of different opportunities. So not just, a park to play in or a place to sit, but also animated spaces. I went to Little Island in New York a couple of months ago, and I was in heaven in Little Island because it was just had such a beautiful variety of sort of active spaces and passive spaces and activities for kids and activities for old people at a food truck. And I happened to be there during the Brazilian music festival. It was lovely. And then lastly, at the neighborhood level, lots of discussion about the 15-minute neighborhood, which essentially means thinking about how to build compact neighborhoods where people can access housing and retail activities and maybe educational activities, and to get around relatively easily in a 10 or 15-minute span of time, whether that's walking or cycling, less emphasis on private automobile, more emphasis on active transportation and public transit. There's some debate around whether these 15-minute neighborhoods actually make sense. Because many examples of 15-minute neighborhoods are actually highly unequal neighborhoods. If you've ever heard of Seaside, Florida, which nobody knows anymore because you didn't maybe see the Truman Show, but that's where the Truman Show is filmed. But essentially it is this sort of new urbanist community. If you go there, a hot dog is about $12. And you have to get on the car and drive on the highway to go to Walmart. So it's beautiful, but it is completely inaccessible to anyone but the wealthiest. So thinking about how to build these 15-minute neighborhoods, you really have to think about all of the other things as well. The future of cities and urban policy, and I think I just have 2 more slides here. First, we need to think about place that, we want to transfer policy from one place to the next because it makes sense, but we really need to think about what makes sense in every given place. The second thing is we need evidence, and there is an abundance of evidence. There's more evidence now, I think, than there ever has been, but understanding how to use that evidence is crucially important. And I think this is especially important for students, and I guess for everyone as lifelong students and learners to understand how to use data and how to use information, how to critique it so that you can make sure to be making good decisions with it. The third is multi-scalar, and this refers to the different levels of governments involved in making decisions and supporting urban development and city growth, because cities are essentially the engines of the economy, and yet they don't have access to all of the resources they need without the support of other levels of government. It really is win-win. And the last is responsive, and we saw during COVID how responsive governments could be and just how nimble, and we shouldn't forget that lesson of being innovative and experimental and trying to produce change. So COVID-19 continues to disrupt cities and disrupt urban life. It's raised huge questions about the future of the downtown core. This is one of the biggest most lingering questions, and the challenge of concentrated office zones and what to do about them. But there are knock-on effects, right? The changing patterns of office work have implications for the future of cities, for the future of urban policy, for the future of development, and for the future of growth. And then lastly, cities remain, despite COVID, despite the challenges of the past several years, and despite the challenges that are still to come, because they are not over, they continue to be economic engines, they continue to be sites of concentration, they continue to lead as innovators, and they continue to be places to resolve great urban challenges. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shauna. It's for an amazing presentation, and also for, I don't know how you do it, but amazing graphics.
I think I have a phenomenal research assistant who is a student, and she did the slides, and I had a graphic designer for my super chart because I never could have done.
Okay. Well, I have plenty of questions, but I know that there are people who want to leave or have to leave earlier. So we've got about half an hour now for questions. So if anyone wants to start asking any particular questions. All right, so if not, I'm going to Neil, go ahead.
So, I really enjoyed this, and part of the reason I really enjoyed it was you gave this sort of retrospective on what happened over the last 3 years, which is sort of something which I don't think we sort of reflect on enough. And at the start of the COVID crisis, I was involved in a team which was advising the Mayor of London on what his response should be. And I look back on that now and I'm a bit like, oh, should we really have said that? So I guess what's the advice you'd give, starting again, if we had another pandemic hit, what would you say to the Mayor of London or the Mayor of Toronto about what their response should be?
That is a great question. I would say be able to respond quickly and rapidly when you need to, collect, review all the data you can get your hands on, and then decide which data is the most valuable, and really dig into it and understand not just what it says, but what it doesn't say. And then the third thing I would say is it's a marathon, not a sprint. I think we said a lot of things at the beginning when we thought we were locked down for 2 weeks, right? And making it through 3 years is a lot longer than 2 weeks. And, you know, COVID's, it's not, we want it to be over. We took off our masks. We removed all of the emergency mandates, but it's, you know, learning to live with something new and different and constantly changing means you really have to figure out how to work quickly across the long view.
Okay, more questions? Go ahead.
Coming back to the office discussion that we had on people being reluctant to come back to offices, do you think that even though people might be reluctant to come back now, that face-to-face interactions and that in-person trust that you don't have working online is so important that will just make people go back anyways?
Well, one, I hope so. I think that, you know, what many professionals have settled into now is a hybrid situation, right? And when I have lots of friends and acquaintances who don't work in academia, and whenever I see them, I sort of quiz them on who's going to their office, what their office policy is. You know, there seem to be a lot of organizations now trying to encourage people to come Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then, of course, you have the mayor of Toronto saying, well, how are we going to invest in a subway that's active on these 3 days, and on the other days, we have no idea who's riding it. And, you know, it's hard to tell someone who works in an office, we need you to go to work, we need to support the subway, right? That's a hard sell. But it seems like, so one, there's the hybrid part. There are also people who are starting to struggle with productivity at home, people who've worked from home, who manage well, who after all this time are starting to see the downside of being home, right? The downside of not, you know, meeting new hires, of not connecting with their colleagues, sharing ideas. It is not the same on Zoom. And there's also a sectoral piece to it, right? Because in some areas, in particular in engineering, and it's easier to work remotely, it seems, and not miss out on some of those connections because of the kind of work. So in some cases, it's work dependent. I think we're still going to see a bump in return to office, but it seems like that's the one that's taking the longest.
Yes,
I in fact had a very similar question. So like basically like don't you think like for example in the very same line of view, there has been a very radical behavioral shift from like, you know, from the pre-COVID period to the post-COVID period. And we, for example, like anecdotally speaking, like if I can, you know, get my salary at home, I'll probably never prefer to go out. So, you know, like that kind of very behavioral shift is like, you know, it's certainly, anecdotally speaking, it's there, right? So don't you think that will kind of impact our recovery towards the pre-COVID levels?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there will be some FOMO, some fear of missing out, right? That all of your peers went to the office and got this opportunity and you didn't get it. You know, you didn't get invited to something, or you didn't get to participate in something because you weren't there and they couldn't see you. And the more people return, the more that will happen. The other thing is for young people, for people just starting out in their careers, it's those, in some ways, young people want to work remotely the most because it gives you such great autonomy. But they're also the ones in many ways who will suffer the most career-wise by not being able to expand their networks in a physical way.
Question over there.
More on working from home. I think for me personally, it's been really interesting. I had a small bit of my career just before COVID, but most of it was through COVID, learning, working from home. And I see most of my contemporaries who've sort of left university in the last 5-6 years, we're now so used to it, and everybody does mix working. And so I feel like it's always going to be 30% less than it was before. That leaves this whole office problem. that seems like a problem that it's not being talked about loads, or you feel like it must be in sort of city planning circles, but in the sort of broader society, it's not being. Is there, and it's hugely expensive. We were talking about it in a seminar earlier today. It's like these buildings are built for offices, and you can't put homes in them because homes are too heavy, and all sorts of logistical problems. What's the most interesting stuff about resolving that problem that you've been hearing about?
I missed the last part.
What's the most interesting sort of propositions about how you resolve that inevitable problem? Or are people, or is the sense that everybody's shying away from not wanting to deal with it because it's too difficult?
Well, I have some colleagues at U of T who say, in Toronto and in other cities where you just imagine that this present can't possibly last. It can't possibly stay like this. And so one of the biggest risks is not thinking about the future, is not saying, how do we plan for the future? And how do we plan for a future in which perhaps we don't need so much office space? I think the first thing is around ensuring and convincing governments and planning departments and development offices to think about what's going to happen if 30% of the office buildings are empty, or if they're empty a certain proportion of the time. Are there other uses for those buildings, right? So could you, and this is very probably impractical right now, but is there a way to take an office building and repurpose it some days of the week? Maybe not. I mean, you could think about conference rooms and boardrooms and offices being used as classrooms for certain things. That's one option. The conversion to housing, as you said, it's expensive, it's impractical. You could tear the building down. That's hugely resource intensive. But you could see that maybe some combination of those things will have to happen in the future, depending on how this goes. And so you need a plan, you need a scenario plan, and at some point you need to be able to say, okay, we hit the time limit, we can't drag our feet any longer, we're gonna have to do something. One of the issues with cities, is this idea that manufacturing jobs are disappearing, right, or have disappeared over the last many, many years, decades in fact. And some cities said, okay, we're done with manufacturing, we're done with zoning land for manufacturing, we're gonna give it all to housing and offices and this and that. And then sometimes you have a resurgence in manufacturing. And so this is again a debate we have in Toronto between the planning department and others is around, do we need to have so much land preserved for the potential of manufacturing? And Toronto actually has quite a bit of manufacturing in the city and manufacturing space in the city, but there's always pressure to build housing on that land.
I know that Michael has to leave in 5 minutes, so Michael gets the privilege and then we go
So
back.
let me make a guess about this trend issue. I mean, so we're early into this, as you pointed out, and this sort of studies are just coming in now. And the ones that I've read, at least, show very strongly that remote interaction is inferior to present interaction in what we might call the most innovative, creative, disruptive, collaborative activities. And as you pointed out, it's really bad for people starting their careers because they don't build up the networks and social capital. But like the studies like by Yang and Jaffe, and there's like 2 or 3 others who show, the results are all consistent. Okay, so I think my guess is, and I think we're in some kind of, way off optimum story right now. Labor markets are tight. So employers have not been willing to force their workers back into work, to the office. Labor markets are gonna start being less tight with the recession that's coming. And employers are going to start saying to people, you have to come back. But behind that, the real trend is that there's going to be a revealed interactivity or productivity sorting process that will go on. That firms are going to discover where they are on the continuum of needing interaction versus not. And those that discover that they had too much office space and didn't need all that interaction will, over time, as their leases expire and so on, make other real estate choices and other hybridity choices. But those buildings will fill up. There will be a transition, but they'll fill up with the most highly interactiveness dependent firms and industries. And those are a growth sector in modern capitalism. So that my prediction would be, I can't give you exactly how many years, but let's give it a 5-year time framework. We won't be talking about too much office space. But what we will have seen is a sorting in, job generation here, and a sorting out process, as is the long-term story of cities, right? So just to guess, and a couple of other remarks, you said something about context. So a lot of your sort of reference point is the North American city, but I'm thinking about, for example, I read the newspaper this morning that in Paris, we're at 98% of transit ridership. And the big crisis is getting enough workers to up the level of service again, because we're completely saturated. And what did drop is automobile traffic, but because we made a 15-year investment in bikes, and we've got 40% less automobile traffic than we did 10 years ago, 40%. It's the biggest drop of any city in the world, right? And a huge rise in transit and in bicycle use. But Paris is a 15-minute city already, right? I mean, it's one of the 3 densest cities in the world. So I do think that in the continental European context, that those dynamics are going to be variations on your theme, because the CBD phenomenon, the empty CBD phenomenon, isn't that present on the continent. We tend to have more sort of dispersed interactive cities than you do in the Anglo-Saxon world. So just those 2 remarks.
Yeah, no, thank you. I agree. And I agree that the context matters. It's very North American focused. I was in Paris in July and the streets were full. Transit was full. And I read that tourism was back to 2019 levels. But what I couldn't find, it might have been a language barrier. I couldn't find any information on what proportion of people were back in their offices. And someone I spoke to said, well, their apartments are very small. Most of them went back to their offices.
Yeah, they are. It's about 80% office occupancy, but rising rapidly. One other thing is, is that transit ridership is higher on weekends now than during the week.
Yes.
So that goes to your point about cities being not repurposed, but the balance between week and weekend has changed.
Yes. In our regional rail system called Metrolinx and Go, which is really it's commuter rail. So it's people and it's all during the week, it's almost entirely commuters, and it dropped and it continued to stay well below 50%, it might be 60, 70%. But on the weekends now, they're I think back to where they were pre-COVID, maybe even more, that they've really sort of encouraged the weekend rider. And they did it in fact strategically as a way to say, come on the weekend, and then maybe you'll want to come back during the week too.
Okay. Questions at the back, over there.
Yeah, my question is about the governmental response and about the level of government, local government and national government. When we talk about national government, that's pretty much clear. Fiscal stimulus, the monetary stimulus, some direct subsidies. And how about the local government? Could you maybe outline the 3 most influential responses from the municipal level government to the crisis?
So, well, I'll outline the 3 most kind of difficult responses, and then I'll try to talk about what they did in a way to improve what happened after, right? Because our provincial government was responsible for the initial kind of state of emergency. And then the city had some extra powers to call its own state of emergency, to call its own mask mandate. And the governance of COVID actually changed during the pandemic. So at one point early on, every region and every city had sort of very unique ability to develop their own kind of reopening strategies or closing down. And that was sort of developed by the province said, okay, anybody with lower than this many cases can reopen and then these people can close. And Toronto stayed closed very long, as did Mississauga and Peel, which is the site, which is home to a lot of warehousing in the airport and many sort of workers in manufacturing. And so later on, the province said, okay, now we're going to go at a province-wide level, right? So we had this kind of change in how we were governing the pandemic from the early days to later days. Some of the things the city did, the city early on faced a lot of pressure to open up the streets, right? There was an increase in cycling, there was an increase in walking, and there was a massive decrease early on in people driving. But the city said, no, we don't want people to go out. We want them to stay home. So we're not going to open our streets. And other cities in Canada, Calgary, Montreal, made Toronto look terrible. They created new cycling paths and pedestrian streets, and Toronto was still saying no. They did, but they changed. A few weeks later said, okay, we'll open up the streets. We'll create these new cycling lanes. So so I think part of it is the learning during the pandemic. I'm not sure I'm totally answering your question, so I apologize. But I would say one thing is around thinking about mobility, restricting mobility and opening up again, thinking about how to encourage mobility. But there's also, politics involved, right? So it's not just evidence. The evidence says people want to cycle, people want to have access to streets, people want to go out. But the politics says, and this is a big debate we had in the fall, there's going to be a baseball game this weekend, and we want to make sure that the Lakeshore Boulevard, which is right by our sports stadium, is not just closed to automobiles, because we want them to be able to drive down. A big debate at City Council, and they actually got rid of the open street, the active street, in order to make room for automobiles. So we've, throughout the pandemic, there's been this kind of shift back and forth, some good learning, some decisions that are a little more core. Today in Toronto, they're discussing again bringing back a mask mandate.
Over here.
Could you discuss a little bit more the possible reasons for the increasing housing prices, and if they are related specifically only to COVID, and also who is buying these houses in the case of Toronto?
So house prices in Toronto have been increasing. Some of it is an acceleration of trends, and the house price increases is an acceleration of a trend that's been happening for probably a decade now. There's one city in Canada where house prices were higher than Toronto, and that was Vancouver. And now I think they might almost be equal. So what was driving it up? Well, growth. Toronto is a growing municipality, and the other thing is wealth, right? So there is a portion of the population that has the wealth to be able to afford those homes, and that drives up the price as those people grow. As we have a growing tech sector, strengths in financial services, strengths in legal services, more encouragement of all these kinds of activities that actually creates wealthier individuals who want to invest in homes. I don't think it's in a lot of places there's a debate around foreign investors and suggestions that foreign investment is what's driving it, where people aren't living in those homes. That is not what's driving up house prices in Toronto. Maybe it represents a small portion of it, but a lot of it is growing wealth and growing demand. And it's also the transfer of generational wealth, right? So these, I don't have it here, but I've seen recently a slide that showed, how much an individual or household had to earn to be able to purchase a home 15, 20 years ago, and how much they have to be able to earn now. And now it is so unwieldy to think about being able to own a home without either, a trust fund, family wealth, you struck it rich in an entrepreneurial venture. Very, very difficult. House prices have started to come down though, as you saw from that side, and that's because of increasing interest rates, which means that although the price has come, the cost of the house has come down, when you add in the interest rates and the mortgage, you may not be paying less. And that's actually going to cause a lot of distress in the housing markets. In Toronto, we didn't have the same kind of distressed housing markets as they did in the US in the 2008 financial crisis. Ours have continued to go up, and so there's the expectation of, I think, about 30% decline crisis.
Just back to the question before, I'm wondering how this makes you think about regional governance and sort of the relevance of local governments. Like I'm thinking about 10 years ago, like Benjamin Barber's, like if mayors ruled the world,
Yeah.
that was kind of like what a lot of us were talking about. A city's the best place for us to be making, policy changes that tackle the climate crisis. But frankly, like a lot of what prevented catastrophic damage to our cities over the past 2 years were just mega federal policies and national policies in lots of different jurisdictions, like mega cash infusions to businesses, mega cash infusions to households. So how do you think about that?
So first, you're right that without the money and the supports provided by the federal government, Canadians and everyone living in Canada would be far worse off today, right? It was those supports, those financial supports that made a huge difference both to individuals and to families. But in terms of regional governance, during, Toronto used to have a regional government called Metro Toronto. It was known as like the city that works. We just had an election in Toronto for mayor, and it was like the city that's falling apart, that doesn't invest properly in anything, that's a disaster. I don't think it's quite that bad, but there are some real challenges. I think that we should have some form of regional government. When you look at, the political boundaries of the city, and then you look at the functional boundaries of the city, they are entirely different. And being able to think through ways to make governing decisions collectively, not the province doing it for them, but the municipalities and the mayors doing it. And we saw this more on an informal basis with, mayors of the regions of the cities within the Toronto region, and especially the biggest cities, convening and sorting out together things around opening and closures, things around safety, things around policy. We had this sort of policy mobility. I think it was in Peel, the medical officer of health, who has the authority to make sort of these emergency mandates, was the first to say any business that has a certain number of people testing positive for COVID, I can't remember if it was 5 or 10, must be closed down. And after they did it in Peel, they did it in Toronto, right? And I think that saved lives, and it saved transmission. It caused hardship, but it was the right thing to do at that time.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I especially appreciated how grounded in reality and descriptive it was. And I think it can be very easy to get lost in these sort of diffuse, discursive questions. But yet on that note, I wanted your insight in grounding a question that I had, which is one thing about COVID. It was a huge point of this sort of culture war clash about masks and vaccines. And is there a kind of grounded geographic analysis that's coming out on that? Because I imagine that the kind of socioeconomic groups that might have appealed to one side or the other are much more diverse than we might assume initially. And so I was just wondering if anything came up about that.
You make it good. COVID has been incredibly polarizing and incredibly political, right? It's been politicized in Canada, in the US, probably in the UK. I think it's a shame, but I haven't seen anything recently. I've read a few pieces that talked about the politicization and the sort of distinctions in terms of, are you to vote conservative or liberal or something else, and what does that mean for your typical view, urban versus suburban perspectives and rural. I don't know if you remember this, but very early on, I think after the first 5-6 months, smaller university campuses in the US were reopening in smaller centers, and they were like, it's okay, we have no COVID here, it's all good, it's in the cities. And I thought, how is it gonna work? Like people from cities and people who are all interacting with each other are gonna go to these smaller places, and there's gonna be COVID, and that's what happened, right? So it's polarizing, and I think it's hugely unfortunate because so many things are polarizing now, and a public health crisis. I guess it's inevitable, but it's a shame.
Back.
Hi, I had a question sort of about if you looked at all of like periphery, like business districts that like had any benefit from COVID and people working from home. I mean, I know personally, I was living in New York and I was in the South Bronx, and working from home was sort of an opportunity to engage with more businesses in my area, which I enjoyed. And so I wondered, is there sort of like this balance now that cities will have to consider? Because I feel like there may be a lot of advantages for like these periphery neighborhoods with more like less expensive housing that were farther from business districts that might benefit, and how they're sort of balancing that of like working,
That's a
like,
great
should they be
point.
investing in that a little bit more if people are happier being able to access things in their neighborhood.
It's not something I've studied, but from what I understand, and you're not talking about a remote community, right? You're talking about the South Bronx, right? But you know, there's some people moving to more remote communities, but within neighborhoods in an urban sort of metropolitan area, there's kind of a reconnection with neighborhood, right? How could there not be? If before you used to, you know, all the time, you know, leave in the morning and come back late at night and we're hardly there. And now, you know, if you go out for lunch and you're in the park and you see your neighbor more. So I think that there are some pieces that talk about stronger connections being built in these neighborhoods and trying to think of ways that actually those don't get lost.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. I'm not going to be able to, we should finish in about a minute and a half. There are 4 hands, so I'm going to take just those 4 questions as far as I know. One here, then one over there, here, and then we'll finish with Lan at the end. And I'll skip my
Are you going to
questions.
answer them?
I think they're the one doing the hard work. I mean, I can try to answer, but I'm going to be
Okay, it's good.
not as good. So
I'll have 30 seconds to answer all 4.
should I just like collect all 4?
Yeah,
or-
yes, no, perfect.
Okay, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, just, or you have touched it briefly, but what about the future financial crisis of the cities affected? And is that a part of the debate for Toronto? Because like it probably, maybe it is, and then like how the public debate goes with where we should then take that those money from. So if it should compensate something for city where government takes it. So how it is debatable.
All right, so next question over there.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, Toronto is a major city and it contains lots of migrant labor, and the panic had forced lots of migrant labor back to their hometown. And after the panic, maybe they do not want to go back to Toronto, and somehow they want to work in their own cities. So I was wondering, how far do you agree that maybe the panic will promote those small cities developments, and maybe those small cities have a faster recovering of economics than those major cities?
Max?
Mine's quite speedy. So we know that COVID suppressed face-to-face contact, which is important for innovation, but it also forced some innovations in medical and remote working and restaurants, you said. So where's the verdict? Is COVID good for innovation or bad for innovation?
Final question, Lan.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, when you spoke about transportation, you just related to public transport. I was wondering what was the trend with automobiles and what the trend is now. Did it lower or did it stay at? I guess the automobile transportation got higher, and if it lowered now or no, and how sensible is it to force people to go back to the office? Because let's say work from home definitely lowers your carbon footprint in this sense, and how this relates to the policies of post-pandemic Toronto, for example.
So 4 questions, 4 different topics.
Okay, so first of all, working remotely doesn't necessarily lower your carbon footprint. There's some evidence and studies that show that actually, even if you drive on fewer occasions, you're driving further distances, and if you have to drive or commute a couple of days a week to an office, but you move further out to do it, to do that. It actually, so it's not a natural conclusion that it lowers the carbon footprint. In Toronto, yes, there is more driving. Driving recovered the fastest. I have another thing on the dashboard that shows the recovery of driving. We don't have as good data on driving recovery, but we have some congestion data. Traffic and congestion is bad once again in Toronto. And so thinking through how do encourage people to use public transit, to use active transit is really important. Max, your question was about, is COVID good or bad for innovation?
Innovation, good or
And,
good?
you know, I don't know, yes and no. I mean, sure, there was a lot of innovation that happened during COVID, and really rapid innovation, right? And a lot of creativity was generated. But I guess the question is like, you know, if we didn't have COVID, you know, would you still rather not have had COVID? Yes. And how do you take that sort of that learning, that burst, and bring it back into a non-COVID world? So maybe it didn't dampen all innovation, but it did dampen some kinds of innovation. Remove migration within regions, maybe back to lower cost settings and to places where you have a community, a family, whatever. In Canada and in Ontario, we've seen an acceleration of the trend of particularly young households just forming, moving to lower cost locations, perhaps where they have a family support system. Again, it's an acceleration of a trend, not a new trend. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to say people aren't going to stay forever. We have this magazine called Toronto Life, and all through the pandemic said they left, they went here, they went there. You know, the New York Times every week shows a lovely family. First, they had all these families moving to their second homes during COVID, which looked very nice. And then they had them all buying homes in new communities in upstate New York. And now they're all going back. And Toronto Life also had they left, they got bored, they returned. I think that we're still going to see that. And then your question is on financial crisis and the impending financial crisis, if I understood right?
No, I
Like
mean,
what we're expecting
the
to come?
future, yeah, the future.
Right, because
financial
we're
crisis of
expecting
cities.
to enter into a recession. It will, but what is the question about the financial crisis?
Is it a debate around Canadian cities and Toronto in particular? So, first question would be: does
we're just starting
Toronto have?
to talk about it. So when the Bank of Canada raised interest rates, most recently, I don't know, last week, the week before, they said we're expecting to be in a recession very soon.
Well, I probably meant that financial problems of cities that has a relation to this to the business earnings that the
So cities struggled. Canadian cities struggled massively during COVID. They lost billions of dollars from lost revenues, and they were held up by federal and provincial funds. If there is a decline in federal, because our cities have very little ability to raise revenues on their own, other than through the property tax. Transit ridership is I think it's like 13%. But otherwise, they don't have a lot of tools to use. So the answer is that we will be in a period of austerity from the position of the federal and provincial governments. That will have a negative impact on Toronto, unless we have a situation where we have a recession, but some parts of the country, and maybe the biggest, actually excel in some way. We don't quite, I don't know. I guess the best answer is I don't know. But it's a really good question.
Okay, so thank you very much. You saw the interest that you raised. I couldn't even ask my questions, which I'll do later. I thought it was fantastic. And many thanks to all of you for coming. Just try to follow the Cañada Blanch Center on our website. Try to follow the events. There will be another event coming on the 5th of December, presented by the fellows, and we have many more already planned for the coming year, so in the land. So thank you very much, and see you all.